Now, I haven't been making videos for a little while. There you are. Got to plug my headphones in. I haven't been making videos for a while because I've just moved house. And it's taken me a while to unpack and get the studio sorted out, a new studio. And this place has got tiles on the floors and I think the sound bounces around quite a bit. So the sound might not be great. I'll try and fix it if I can, but if I can't, apologies. And I'll try and do something about that in future, because my sound is sometimes really terrible. Anyway, on to Paula Vennells, because she's terrible too. Paula Vennells, previous CEO of Post Office Ltd and the person at the heart of the Post Office scandal, appeared before the Post Office Horizon IT inquiry on May 22nd, 23rd and 24th. For the first 2 days, she was being questioned by Jason Beer, a Deputy High Court judge acting on behalf of the inquiry. Vennells started off by essentially saying the system was to blame for the scandal. Beer challenged that and said, nope, no it wasn't, it was the person. And the person is you, Paula Vennells, you were to blame. Now, in my videos, I've been arguing that most of the time it's the system that's to blame. So am I in agreement with Vennells on this one? Was the system the problem? And was she the victim? Well, no, I'm not going to say that. Thank goodness I'm with Jason Beer on this one. I think he's right to blame Vennells. He's right to blame the person. But does that mean I'm contradicting what I've said in my other videos where I say that the system is most often to blame? Well, no, I'm not. And in this video, I'll tell you why. In the areas of psychology that I've been mostly working in, community psychology and critical psychology, we tend to trouble the practice of blaming individuals for social problems. We call it victim blaming. In community psychology, it's cited as one of the key principles of the field that we should avoid victim blaming, and that principle is held on to by many community psychologists really quite dearly. The avoidance of victim blaming is also important in critical psychology, where it's most commonly invoked in regards to the construction of the concept of mental illness. Many critical psychologists argue that the cause of mental illness doesn't reside in the person, it's not a problem with them, but it's a problem with a social system, such as a system that creates social inequality and poverty. It's those things that are the major causes of poor mental health. I also referred to the victim blaming argument in relation to the Post Office scandal in my previous 4-part series on the scandal, where I talk about Milgram studies on obedience. And the lesson from that work is that we too readily jump to the conclusion that bad things happen because bad people do bad things. And in case you haven't heard about the Post Office scandal, there's some bad things, really bad things happened there. It's the biggest miscarriage of justice in British legal history. It's causing a huge public outcry in the UK. Quick summary for you. The people who ran small local post offices, those people are called sub-postmasters, well, they were blamed for shortfalls in the revenues of those small post offices, but actually there were no shortfalls. The IT system that they were required to use, called Horizon, was faulty. It reported losses when there were none. And that IT system, Horizon, was at fault, and the post office blamed the sub-postmasters, not the IT system. What happened was thousands of sub-postmasters were told to pay back the money, even though the money was not missing. And there were over 900 wrongful convictions made against sub-postmasters of things like theft and false accounting. Some went to prison. At least one committed suicide. So the sub-postmasters were blamed for a problem caused by a system. It was a classic case of victim blaming. Now let's get to Paula Vennells, the CEO of Post Office Ltd at that time. Well, she seems to think that she was the victim of the system too. I don't know. Let's get into it. Now, Vennells would have been heavily briefed by her lawyers prior to the hearings. She would likely have done a few rehearsals with her lawyers of being asked difficult questions and would have had a clear plan for how to handle those difficult questions. On day one of her 3-day appearance at the inquiry, she actually said that she had no strategy for answering the questions at the inquiry, that such a thing was not possible, that you couldn't prepare for such a thing. She said that when she was being asked about an addendum to a briefing document that she'd been given by her team prior to going into a parliamentary select committee to talk about the scandal that was emerging around the Horizon system and the prosecution of sub-postmasters. I think this is 2015. I think it was 2015. The addendum was a document that outlined a strategy that she was told to follow of not telling everything to the select committee unless pushed. She was briefed to withhold information from the select committee when and where she could, effectively to withhold and essentially mislead Parliament, which is a very, very bad thing to do.
As we've discussed, the addendum includes a strategy to hold four lines, the first four, give certain information when pushed, and further information if pushed further. Did you agree with that strategy?
No, as I said, I'm not sure that I would necessarily have taken it this way. I didn't ask for that strategy. I don't suppose I even considered it on the morning of the select committee.
Why did you think you wouldn't consider it, having identified the topic as an important one? Having asked specifically for a briefing about it and having been given a briefing?
I meant I wouldn't have considered the strategy and the way this is set out in terms of 3 different ways of approaching it. And the reason I wouldn't have considered that is that I would respond to the questions as they were asked, and I would respond to the select committee openly and honestly with what I knew and could recall at the time under the pressure of the select committee. But I wouldn't have gone in, you can't do that. It's like sitting here today. You can't come into these sorts of very high pressure environments with a strategy as to how you're going to handle it.
The fact that she said that she didn't have a strategy was perhaps a sign that she did. Her strategy was to pretend not to have a strategy. Now, whether that's true or not, she was clearly very well prepared. That was evident very early on. She'd submitted a very extensive witness statement to the inquiry, which she sent to the inquiry early in March. And the witness statement ran to 775 pages. It became even more evident how much she had prepared when later on during day 3 of the inquiry, or her appearance at the inquiry, she was being questioned by Edward Henry, who was representing 5 former sub-postmasters: Tracy Felsted, Seema Misra, Janet Skinner, Nicky Arch and Lee Castleton. Now, Mr. Henry could be much more adversarial than Mr. Beer, because Mr. Beer works for the inquiry and Mr. Henry works for the sub-postmasters. So Mr. Henry tended to give some witnesses more of a grilling, and he had a bit of a harsher tone. And he gave Vennells quite the grilling on day 3.
You are responsible for your own downfall, aren't you?
From when the Court of Appeal passed its judgment, I lost all the employment that I have had, and since that time, I have only worked on this inquiry. It has been really important to me to do what I didn't or was unable to do at the time I was Chief Executive, and I have worked for the last 3 years and prioritised this above anything else. For the last year, it has probably been a full-time job, and it is my commitment. I have avoided talking to the press, perhaps to my own detriment, because all the way through I have put this first.
Apart from the woe is me tone to this, you can take what she said here two ways: that she was working very hard to help the inquiry, or that she was working very hard to help herself, to prepare a defence against the inquiry accusing her of wrongdoing. Whichever way, she'd been working long and hard on thinking about how to answer the questions that she thought she would be asked at the inquiry. Whether that's having a strategy or being super prepared is an open question. But in spite of all of that preparation, it looked like she was not prepared for the first two questions asked by Mr. Beer on day one. The first was that, given all of the information she'd included in her witness statement about all the documents she was not shown as the scandal was happening and all the false assurances she'd been given by the Post Office that there were no problems to address, did she think that she was the unluckiest CEO in the United Kingdom? It was a rhetorical question that Vennells could only answer no to. It was more of a kind of point-scoring question, or rather pointing to the absurdity of the claims Vennells was making in her witness statement. Vennells responded by saying that she was too trusting towards those around her, a kind of tangential way of blaming those who were around her and advising her. Mr. Beer then laid out the groundwork for his next rhetorical question. He listed out a long sequence of things that Vennells had claimed in her witness statement that she was not told about at the time. There were 18 of these things in all. And after he'd listed them all, one by one, he then asked this.
If all of the facts and matters that I've just described are true, and if what you say is reliable, was there a conspiracy at the Post Office which lasted for nearly 12 years, involving a wide range of people, differing over time, to deny you information and to deny you documents and to falsely give you reassurance?
Here, what he was doing was pointing out how the claims Vennells had made in her witness statement, that she didn't know much about anything that was going on in relation to the scandal as it was happening, well, he was pointing out that that was clearly ridiculous. And the question seemed to throw Vennells for a moment or two, and then she responded by switching tack, and rather than blame those around her, she blamed the system. She explained that the problem was caused by faulty structures. That meant information was not passed on through the organisation and thus not passed on to her. She then broadened that out to suggest that it was a system problem experienced by many large corporations.
I think because of the way that the reporting had been planned, management information across many areas of a business tends to be written in layers of escalation. And the layers of escalation that were selected around IT and Fujitsu were such that it didn't. And I think this probably happens in many, many other large institutions too. It didn't give you, on a board, a line of sight to what happened to an individual. And we are seeing the terrible impact of that today.
Beer then summed up for Vennells what she'd said. He summed up her answer quite well.
You don't believe that there was a conspiracy to deny you information and documents. The reason such information and documents didn't reach you was the way that the company was organised and structured.
So this seemed to be getting her off the hook. There were no bad actors. It was just that Post Office Limited was badly organised and badly structured. She was a good person, trying her best, working in a dysfunctional organisation. So unsurprisingly, Vennells responded to that summary that Beer gave without equivocation.
I think in the majority of cases, yes, that is true.
The word true is a big word to use in a public inquiry where you've taken the oath to only tell the truth. Vennells really wanted to stamp that explanation into her testimony, but it was a trap. Beer followed up with the killer question.
Who was responsible for organising and structuring the company?
Of course, the answer was that Vennells was. She was responsible. She quickly backtracked to a previous answer and switched that argument back to blaming the people around her again.
Sorry, if I may just say, the other point is that I have seen documents and I have heard evidence where I think colleagues did know more information than was shared, and in those cases either mistakes were made or they decided it wasn't appropriate to do so.
So what's happening here is that the blaming the system rather than the individual tactics suited Vennells' interests up until the point that it didn't. She went from claiming that the problem was that she and her team were victims of a dysfunctional system who therefore weren't to blame, to then go on to blame her team for being dysfunctional. Why did she do that? Well, it's that thing about vested interests. Because it was in her interests to switch the argument. And we need to ask that question. In whose interest is it that this person is making that argument that we shouldn't blame victims? It's the thing that sits at the heart of critical thinking. It's the thing that sits at the heart of critical psychology. And here's the problem with the principle of avoiding blaming the victim, which is held to so dearly by community psychology. It's one of the reasons I left community psychology. It's a problem because it's held as a principle, as a core principle, as a first principle, as a thing that shouldn't be criticized, that should come above all else, when it shouldn't. We should always be asking in whose interests are we making a particular argument. In this case, we should be asking in whose interests are we avoiding blaming the victim. If we don't ask that, if we don't question and potentially criticize that principle of victim blaming, avoiding victim blaming, then we're in trouble because we risk letting people in power off the hook. Because as Henry put it to Vennells on day 3 of the inquiry, she was responsible for her own downfall. People in positions of power and authority can be victims of badly functioning systems. Of course they can. But they can be responsible for those systems. Even if they aren't directly responsible, they're often in positions of power that means that they can change those dysfunctional systems. In many regards, they're victims of their own actions or inactions. So it's okay to blame them, even when they are victims, because they're to blame when those systems that they're responsible for not only hurt them, but hurt everyone around them. So good on you, Jason Beer, and screw you, Paula Vennells. Okay, I better end there. So, hope you found that useful. Till next time. Ta-da.